Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So, yesterday was verse 28 done or not? Who gave the classes to Toby, Sheshan, Pratipadya nearby us? Anyone remember? Was anyone here?
I did class yesterday.
Oh, wait.
There was no class yesterday.
Oh, okay. So we'll do text 28. It's very technical verses anyway. Why don't we'll chant this, then we'll look at it and see what it is. It's quite technical. So, tato vishesham pratipadya nirbhayas. Oh, do you have the verse?
Yeah.
Tato vishesham pratipadya nirbhayas.
Tato Vishesham Pratipadya Nirvayas.
Tenatmanapo na Tenatman Tenatmanapo nalamurtiratvaran
Tenatmanapo Nalamurtiratvaran.
Jyotirmayo vayumupetya kale
Jyotirmaya Vayumupatya Kale.
Vaivatmana kang Brihadatmalingam
Vaivatmanam Brihadatmalingam.
Vaivatmanakam Brihadatmalingam
Vaivatmanam Brihadatmalingam.
Tato Vishesham Pratipadya Nirvayas
Tato Vishesham Pratipadya Nirvayas.
Tenatmanapo Nalamurtiratvaran
Tenatmanapo Nalamurtiratvaran.
Jyotirmayo Vayumupetya Kale
Jyotirmaya Vayumupatya Kale.
Vaivatmanakam Brihadatmalingam
Vaivatmanam Brihadatmalingam. Tato Vishesham Pratipadya Nirvayas.
Tato Vishesham Pratipadya Nirvayas
Tenatmanapo Nalamurtiratvaram.
Tenatmanapo Nalamurtiratvaran
Jyotirmaya Vayumupatya Kale.
Jyotirmayo Vayumupetya Kale
Vaivyatmanakam Brihadatmalingam.
Vaivatmanakam Brihadatmalingam.
Okay. Tato Vishesham Pratipadya Nirvayas
Tato Vishesham Pratipadya Nirvayas
Tenatmanapo Nalamurti Atparam
Tenatmanapo Nalamurtiratvaran
Jyotirmayo Vayam Petchakale
Jyotirmayo Vayumupetya Kale
Vaivatmanakam Brihadatmalingam
Vaivatmanakam Brihadatmalingam. So, let's see how Prabhupada translates these words. Tato, thereafter, Vishesham, particularly Pratipadya, obtaining, by obtaining nearby without any doubts. Tena, by that Atmana, pure self, Apa, water, Analo, fire, Murti, forms, Atvaran, by surpassing, Jyotirmayo, effulgent, Vayum, atmosphere, Upeti, having reached their Kale, in due course of time, Vayu, air, Atmana, by the self, Kang, ethereal, Brihat, great, Atmalingam, the real form of the self. So this is, again, you could say a lost science. It's like if you read, let's say, a science book, but the science had been lost. No one actually knew what the science was anymore. It would be confusing. So this is how Prabhupada translates this. After reaching Satyaloka, the devotee is specifically able to be incorporated fearlessly by the subtle body in an identity similar to that of the gross body. An ident- and one after another, he gradually attains stages of existence from earthly to watery, fiery, glowing, and airy, until he reaches the ethereal stage. So let's look at these words, and I'll get to Prabhupada's purport. Tato, thereafter. So when you have, it starts with a tato, so what came before this? Nayatra Shoko Najaran and Mrityu. We're talking about a world in which there's no lamentation, old age, no death, no suffering, no agitation. They Yachit Tato Da Kripaya Nidang Vidam. So it's interesting. They're talking about the spiritual world where that there's no lamentation, old age, death, suffering, disturbance, and except there's chit, there's consciousness, and that leads people to be merciful, kripaya, and merciful toward those who are anidang vidang. Uh, idang means this in the sense of truth, and so unidang means not this knowing. In other words, not this. In other words, instead of knowing this, instead of knowing the truth, they are not this knowers. So in other words, they don't know the truth. Sounds a little more natural in Sanskrit. So duranta duko prabhavanu darshanat, and uh, they're suffering because, or they're in ignorance because duranta dukkha. Duranta is translated here, this is the previous verse, as unsurpassable. Anta means an end, some like the end of something. And so duranta means something that's hard to end, something which just keeps going on and on and on in a negative sense. And so duranta dukkam is suffering which just seems like it's just never going to end. Duranta is hard to find the end of it. As we've experienced, yes. It's hard to find the end of the unpleasantness of this world. So duranta dukkha prabhavanu darshanat. So anyway, so that was a previous verse. And then this verse begins to toe. Thereafter, Vishesham Pratipadya. Pratipadya means coming to or arriving at. Vishesham, uh, which is, it can mean variety, distinction. Nirvaya, without fear. Tena, by that. Atmanapo, lamurtir, by the self. It's a very sort of technical verse. By the pure self. Apo, water. Analo, fire. Murti, the form. So there's a form of water and fire. And by surpassing that, upetya, one achieves vayu, wind or air, and then which is jyotirmaya, which is made of light, kale in time, and then vaivatmana by the air body, by the air self, literally, by the air self, kam, brihadatmalingam, one then achieves kam, space itself, like outer space, the great space, and then atmalingam, the actual distinct form of the self. So clearly, this is talking about a science that is pretty much lost to us at the present time, but at least we can get the general idea. But again, what sort of the common denominator in this verse and the many other verses like this is that one has to progress in life. I mean, the simple part of this is that one has to move from the gross to the subtle. And as one moves from the gross to the subtle, from earth and water to fire and air, and then kang, sky, and then and so on, that the coverings of the soul become less dense. And then, I mean, whether it's going up like from the body, from the lower parts of the body to the higher parts of the brain to blow out the the prana, and the soul through the top of the head, or whether it's, and then of course, the different worlds of the universe are mapped onto the body. So, in a sense, as you're going up higher and higher, it it's also there's an idea of going higher and higher in the universe to higher and higher states of existence and states of consciousness. So, kind of what ties together all these very esoteric descriptions in this chapter is the idea of progressing, that life is meant to progress, and ultimately the goal is Krishna. So they had their own way of doing it back then. These are previous yugas when people are more advanced, and they had all these subtle sciences that were full of symbolism and connections between things. It's interesting because the body becomes highly symbolic. I mean, the body is highly symbolic in the Vedic culture. I mean, one sort of astonishing example is that when Ashwatthama, which means horse bellow or horse neigh, because stam in Sanskrit, stam is that's sort of like the noise, the horse whinny, or the noise that a horse makes, and then it becomes in compound you drop the s, so it becomes tama. So Ashwa, of course, is horse. And so when Ashwatthama was born, he made this sort of neighed like a horse. So he was called Horse Neigh. They weren't very what's the word, squeamish about giving names back then. They they gave very they gave all kinds of names to people that somehow stuck. So I don't know if that's what people really called each other. I mean, if they really called him, hey, here's my good buddy, Horse Winnie, or but so it's interesting. But anyway, so Ashwatthama committed one of the most heinous crimes recorded in the Mahabharata, where he murdered 5 sleeping young men, which was just the last word in terms of violating all the chivalrous, the code of chivalry.
Were they even men?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times there's sort of hyperbole, like it said that someone was just a boy, but almost like we would do that. Let's say someone's 20 years old, and then the person's killed. Oh, he was just a boy. He was just, he was practically a child. So there's a lot of that also.
Okay, because I was under the impression that they killed much kids. But
No, because if they were kids, hey, Lonnie, if they were kids, that would mean that the Pandavas begot them when the Pandavas were like maybe 90 years old or something. Because if Krishna lived for 125 years on this planet, and Krishna was, because it's still Dwapara Yuga. So it's not that, let's say yesterday was Dwapara Yuga and people lived for, I don't know, maybe like, 1,000 years or 500 years. But today is Kali Yuga. So the life expectancy just suddenly got reduced by 10 or by something like that. It's just like seasons. One season gradually merges into the other season. So, and it's often said in the Shastra that the very moment Krishna left this world was the beginning of Kali Yuga. The very moment Krishna left. And so that means that it's just at the end of Dwapara Yuga. So they lived for 125 years, and they and these were all, of course, the children of Draupadi, and Draupadi married the Pandavas uh, before even the gambling match. And then there was like 14 years of the gambling match. Of course, we know that when so if we try to construct the timeline, we know that when the Pandavas married Draupadi, they came out of hiding because they had an army behind them. They had a major, Panchala was a major kingdom, and they had an army. And the Pandavas themselves were, very feared as warriors. So when they had not only their own strength, but also Panchala, they had a whole nation behind them. That's when it was safe to come out of hiding. And they did so. And that's when they had to make this agreement that will divide the kingdom. So then they go to Pandavas take basically the Indraprastha and the surrounding areas, Khandava Prastha, and it's a whole story why Duryodhana gave him specifically that piece of land. Well, I'll tell you very quickly, because it turns out that in the jungle around Indraprastha, which was called Khandavaprastha. There was like this very dense forest or jungle, and that's where the Asura beasts were living. So the idea was, okay, let's give them the most dangerous part of the Kuru land, and maybe, by natural causes they'll disappear. Of course, that's why the Khandava forest had to be burned down, not because Agni needed sort of a super Alka-Seltzer, but because that's where all the Asura beasts were, who were killing Brahmins. That's the real story behind it. Anyway, so if you follow the timeline, and then like when were these five kids born? I mean, were they begotten? If they were begotten in Indraprastha, they would have been like, maybe 40 years old, 40-year-old, 50-year-old kids. So, or did they beget? Because what's interesting is we have to see, like, you have to go back and check Mahabharata exactly when did the Pandavas actually each have a son with Draupadi. So therefore, the idea that they were just kids, I think, is not really feasible. Otherwise, the begetting them would have been like an afterthought, like, hey, Draupadi says to the Pandavas, we've been married for like 50 years. Maybe it's time to think about a family.
Thank you for that verification.
So, um, so they had their own signs. So these are technical descriptions. These are technical descriptions, but what ties them all together is that in all of these descriptions, which are in the second canto, it's interesting. The second canto is giving all these different things, like going to the higher planets, like you go to, from Patala, Talatala, Rasatala, all the Talas. And Tala actually means surface, like the surface of, like, for example, Mam Vishnu Padaya, Krishna Prasaya, Bhutale. So Bhutale literally means on the surface of the earth. So that's what Tala means. I know some of you were losing sleep over that. So then Patala, Rasatala, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So and so, sort of putting aside for a moment all the really technical, basically lost to us today, details of all these descriptions, what they all have in common is that life is meant to be progressive. You're supposed to be moving up. You're not supposed to just like be stuck in the one place. And so if you think about it, I mean, consider this. Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita that four kinds of souls approach me. Chaturvidha means four kinds. Chaturvidha bhajante mam. And two of them want, suffering or wants material things. So of the four, two are just sort of grossly looking for material benefit. But at least they're pious because they go to Krishna. So, but they do want material things. And so, I forget what I was going to say. Actually, I lost my train of thought there. But so, oh, I know. So as a devotee, let's say someone joins the Hare Krishna movement, and the person is in one of these two categories. Like they joined the movement because they were suffering. And you hear these stories, it's like a whole genre in Back to Godhead magazine, how I came to the movement. Of course, you hardly read those stories anymore since so few Western people actually join the movement these days. So it's kind of a, not so much of a genre now, Back to Godhead. But anyway, so, and sometimes you get these stories that, well, I was suffering or whatever. But the downside of that is, or the corollary of that, is that if someone joins a movement because they were looking for relief or whatever, or even if they were the curious, let's include the Jigasu. 3 out of 4, 75% of the people that joined the Hare Krishna movement just wanted something other than Krishna. It's either like, because you could say, well, to want Krishna and to want knowledge of Krishna are not exactly the same thing. Because you can just say, oh, I was just curious. I know myself. I can't count how many times, especially when I was younger and I used to go to Sunday feast and sort of, dare the laws of nature to terminate my life by eating all this rich food. And so, I mean, I can't count how many times I sat down with someone and I was explaining everything, and they say, "Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, that really makes sense to me." And of course, you'd never see them again. They were just curious.
It seems to me that Jikasu wants knowledge but doesn't want to apply it. They just want
Exactly.
It's just like scratching some mental itch or something.
Yeah, very well put. Very well put. That's exactly what it is.
Hmm.
Yeah. So then what we have is three-fourths. And let's say, for example, there's the drink. So let's say, for example, that three-fourths of the people who joined the Hare Krishna movement are sort of in one of those categories. What that means is, what you would expect is that three-fourths of the people in the Hare Krishna movement, once they're kind of situated, as we say, are not really that they don't have a burning desire to make further advancement. It's like if you go to a grocery store and you buy the things on your list, you don't just hang out in the grocery store. You put it in your car and drive home. And so that's what they do. They kind of, okay, I sort of got what I came for. So you put that in your trunk and then just sort of drive back to your griha. Because now, I kind of straightened out my life. At least I have. And that's what most people on earth do. Whatever their religion is, it just gives them a certain comfort, a certain orientation. I'm not completely lost in the world. I know what's ultimately important. Now I can get about my real business, which is just being happy in the world. And so if these, and of course we don't have the numbers, like Christian doesn't say that, okay, it's not like the modern thing where they calculate everything. Okay, 7% of all the people that approach Krishna are in the category of Jnani, and maybe 11% are in the Jigasu categories. We don't have numbers. So we can't really assume that it's the same number in each category. But still, just very roughly calculating, basically what you see is what you would expect, that a very strong majority of people in the Hare Krishna movement are not really focused on let's spread the movement, like the missionary spirit. And so, well, now that I've made a sincere effort to depress everyone, so this is what we have here. And so again, these are very subtle and sometimes symbolic, technical descriptions in the second canto, but what they all have in common is that they're all focused on making progress and ultimately toward a pure spiritual state in Krishna. So, any questions on these points?
I find your analysis interesting because I always thought of it differently, that of the four types of individuals that approach Krishna, most of those types are not actually going to become devotees, and those who become devotees are in one or maybe two categories.
Well, Krishna does say Chaturvidha Bhajante Ma, that four kinds of people worship me. So these are people that not only,
Well, there are lots of karmakundis that worship Krishna.
of course, India is sui generis in its own category, but as the movement spreads, not necessarily at the highest levels, but as the movement spreads even in the West, I've noticed that in many ways, the Western Hare Krishna movement is looking like India, especially because, well, for one thing, it's India centered. The holy places are in India, the cultural centers in India, and so there's a lot of sort of like this sort of spiritual tourism. People go there, and what we see is that Western devotees are very happy to pick up all kinds of superstitions and all kinds of stories, whether it's about snapping your fingers to chase away demons, or whether it's dress style, or whether it's cuisine or music. For example, there's, I mean, for a movement the size of ISKCON, there's an extremely tiny number of people who are seriously trying to master Western music in order to,
Hmm.
present Krishna musically.
Would you say it's because we've just lost that
Loving feeling.
that definitely that but the cultural element, like, you know, who is doing that in any kind of religious tradition now, trying to make that kind of music? Like, it's not like the Baroque era where they're really imbibing that feel. It doesn't seem like anyone's doing it in any religious tradition. I might be wrong with that.
Oh yeah, no, there's Christian rock.
Okay.
The movements, I mean, yeah, many Christian groups and even Jewish groups, they're like doing contemporary music.
Okay.
So we even have Sahajas now. We have all kinds of things. I mean, basically, the Western Vaishnavism and all at all its different levels is really just a microcosm of India now. And so then, if you, as we often say, the Sankirtan movement, it's interesting because one simple question you could ask, which I never really thought for, but what's the Sanskrit word for movement?
Hmm.
Does the Chaitanya Charitamrita explicitly describe Lord Chaitanya's, movement as a movement? Because we have that English word movement, which we think of activism and actively spreading. They certainly did that. I mean, there was certainly preaching going on even during Lord Chaitanya's time. But the idea that, and here's a sociological question: is it really viable? Does it really happen where or under what conditions does it happen? Where you get, let's say, a religious or spiritual society that is able to remain perpetually or over a long period of time in the sociological mode of a movement, as opposed to just sort of settling down into being a society which makes certain gestures towards the public. Or I mean, the Latter day Saints, as they would ultimately prefer to be called, um, they, perhaps more than other groups, have maintained sort of this missionary spirit over an extended period of time. And of course, there are certain born again groups and so on. There are certain ambitious Jewish groups, but they preach to Jews, trying to get Jewish people to come back into the fold. So it's interesting. So if you ask the question, under what conditions, under what historical conditions, does a so-called movement retain sort of the sociological characteristics of a movement, and or is it more often than not that it just sort of settles down and, I mean, into being just sort of a society? One very interesting example is the Salvation Army.
Major Barbara.
What?
Was it Major Barbara?
Major Barbara, exactly. George Bernard Shaw wrote a play called Major Barbara, and personally where Brahma Tirtha and I get most of our clothes, but but if you think of the Salvation Army,
You should get married there, right?
I was married in a Salvation Army warehouse, not even in a Salvation Army office, but in a Salvation Army warehouse. So I think you, following the footsteps of the Guru, will try to arrange a similar venue.
I'll have a look on Google Maps. Seems around.
But what's interesting is if you think of the name Salvation Army, that they really were like that. They used to wear military uniforms, and they were very zealous, and they had like military bands where they would play music, and it was really the idea. I mean, it was very much literally the Salvation Army. And now it's just a group of warehouses where in indigent people can, find clothes or other items, smaller pieces of furniture. I don't know what they give out these days. But so you can start out. I mean, that's, I think, perhaps the most dramatic example of starting out very zealous, very militant. I mean, really, literally militant, and then becoming just just almost exclusively mundane charity, giving out clothes and whatever else they give out. And so, if you look at the Hare Krishna movement, which would be an interesting sociological case study, would start out very zealous, and now in most places is very unzealous. And so, and we used to use military sort of, metaphors and things like that. Probably even said as if in military discipline. And, so anyway, these are interesting things to think about. Fortunately, we have the luxury of just thinking about it intellectually, but of course, we want to see Prabhupada's mission succeed. But I think this is the kind of analysis which very strikingly never goes on. For one thing, because we don't have a significant group of devotees that are even capable of this kind of analysis or trained academically to make these kinds of analyses. And even if there were, there's not so much interest in it because it's more comforting just to rely on prophecies. Because the nice thing about relying on prophecies is you don't actually have to do anything. So, yes.
I have a separate question. In Prabhupada's translation, he speaks of the body as gradually attaining stages of existence from earthly to watery, fiery, glowing, and airy, until he reaches the ethereal stage. So it seems like that's the last stage. In the word for word, it's Atma Lingam, the real form of the self. So I'm wondering, is the ethereal stage being equated with the swarup of the soul, but the actual soul's intrinsic body?
Yeah, the language is not, it doesn't seem very precise.
Okay.
Atmalingam, a linga is sort of a visible form of something, like a symbolic or visible form of something, like the Shiva lingam, symbolic form of Shiva. So, so therefore, when you say Atmalingam, sort of like the symbol of the soul, or recognizable
Okay.
characteristic of the soul.
Thank you.
Any questions, comments? Yes.
You mentioned, I forget the word.
He has all this. He was on a plane.
I was on the plane,
He's
yeah.
got all these pent up.
I'm going to get them out. You mentioned a word, tale. Is it tale?
Bhutala, yes, Bhutala, the earth's surface. And then we say Bhutale. Krishna Prastai, he's most dear to Krishna on the surface of the earth, in other words, on the earth, not talking about sort of strange creatures inhabiting other parts of the earth.
That's what I was wondering, because it implies that there's places you could inhabit. If
I don't know if that's it or if it's just a way of speaking. Like even in English, we would say, on the surface of the earth, just as an what's it?
Face of the earth.
Yeah, the face of the earth. Yeah, exactly the same thing.
Okay.
So Brahmatirtha, any questions, comments on these topics?
So, this is all detailed stuff for me. I when I see these verses, I don't usually try to understand the details. I look at the big picture about what's being said.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It'd be like me reading a computer manual.
yeah.
And yeah, because personally, I'm just not so inclined to technical things.
But I mean, I think it's I mean, there's a good intent in being there, though, to show that there is a technical science. But I think that technical science is something we no longer have much access to.
No, and if this was more accessible, God only knows how many Hare Krishna devotees would be trying this out at home.
It's true, yeah. Yeah, it's just a lot of like fifth canto is there just to give us, impress us that there's a lot we don't know.
Yeah, it's a very well said. Yeah, I think that's exactly it. Show us that there's a lot we don't know.
Yeah,
And
but
that,
I like that. I mean, I
Yeah.
like being awed.
yeah, and there were previous ages in which they have their own science and their own manuals and so on. In a sense, the second canto is like something like a technical manual, but we just don't have the science anymore. Or the power to do it, yes?
Would you say then that, given that the Sankhya elements, the number of them seems to differ depending on where you read, that we could say that that's just a model as well? It's not, they're not describing a reality when they say these particular elements. It's more modeling functions, perhaps.
Well, actually, Krishna says, I think it's in the 11th canto, where he's giving, like, some people say there's 18, some people say there's 24. And Krishna just says that they're just different sages analyze it in different ways, or different
Okay.
ways of enumerating basic, fundamental material principles, both gross and psychological. And so Krishna is kind of encouraging us to do just what you said. He's relativizing it and said, you can think of it as this number, that number, the other number. And the conclusion is obviously, who cares?
Hmm.
Because if you can think, so it's just, I think that alone, Krishna's statement, well, some people give this number, some people give that number, is just showing us that it's not that important. So don't get hung up on it.
Thank you. That's something.
Wouldn't that be terrible if you escaped from a life in biology and then found yourself thrashing about these Bhagavatam chapters?
I have. I have been thrust around.
So,
Release me from my torture, please.
any other questions? So we'll end here. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Srila Bhagavatam.
Have you changed start time back to 6:30?
Yeah, we did.
Oh.